Okay, do I have this on now? Check this. I check stuff that we have to deal with. Which side was the mute? Or...
let's see. So now,
try it again.
Speak into it and see if it works.
Okay, are we here?
I think we're good.
Good. The joys of post-COVID, I suppose. Well, for one thing, I should say that when I lived in Dover, I traveled just as much every week, but it was commuting to Manchester and back. So, doing it all one fell swoop is rather eye-opening. Well, I'm so thrilled that you all came out tonight to take a look at an important side of our community's rich past. What I see as its biggest minority until the textile mills arrived, the Quakers. As Dover celebrates its 400th anniversary, I hope to add something to your understanding of what makes this small city so remarkable and, at times, unexpectedly groundbreaking. And just as a footnote to the series that's been announced, I can attest that Andy and Kathy's presentation will be BAFO, as will Tony's. 3 weeks, was it 3 weeks or just 2? We had a thing together and loved being on the stage with them. When we were scheduling this event, I was surprised to hear that the most popular historical page on the library's website was a story about the harsh persecution of the 3 Quaker women in 1662, shown in the slide. I'm told that right now that's not up, that they're revamping the website or something. So if you're not familiar with the incident, let me briefly explain that the 3 missionaries came to town, were arrested, and after being convicted of violating the colony's anti-Quaker laws, were stripped to the waist, tied to the back of an ox cart, and ordered whipped in every town from here to Dedham, Massachusetts, south of Boston. In effect, a death sentence in the late December. Fortunately, one constable down the road was so appalled by the order that he instead released the women, who then returned to Dover for more. The details fill a chapter in my new book, Quaking Dover. They also inspired one of Greenleaf Whittier's best-known poems. The illustration you're looking at is from an edition of his collected poetry. The common assumption has been that there were no Quakers in town before then, but that in the aftermath, a third of the residents aligned themselves with the radical Quaker faith. Do note that that was just a decade after the movement erupted in the throes of Britain's revolutionary world turned upside down. Dover wasn't exactly a backwater. Did so many Dover folks actually become Quakers? I can now say that yes, they did. For perspective, I should point out that there were perhaps 60 households in town at the time. So 20 would make a decent congregation or meeting, as we call it, especially when you include children, grandparents, unmarried adults, and even workmen and servants. To my surprise, I also discovered that Quakers, or the Society of Friends, as we're more formally known, were worshiping in Dover for at least 3 years before that, despite the laws. 3 prominent Friends had even been hanged in Boston after visiting Dover. As I explained a few weeks ago in the Dover 400 presentation, my quest to discover why so many Dover residents were receptive to the Quaker message led me to many other surprises. Quite simply, the town presents an alternative perspective to the dominant Boston-based version of New England history, as we were taught. Rather than repeating a sampling of the ways Dover was a hit for religious dissidents and social misfits, I'll point you to the book, and tonight's focus will instead be on some of the Quaker impact. Allow me to read some excerpts from the book. To worship in the manner of Friends, people could sit together silently without need of a preacher. Just 2 or 3 could be sufficient. There was no creed to recite, nor was there a liturgy or any outward sacrament. Vocal ministry could arise among anyone so gathered and waiting for the presence of the Holy Spirit, the light of Christ. Those prominent Friends traveling to spread and nurture the faith, the vagrants in Puritan estimation, or Valiant 60 and their successors in the Friends, had a unique calling, tested through their persecutions but guided by Quaker elders. How could this not rattle the established church or government to its core? Their very language spoke, and in the worship, a blend of scripture and mystical personal experience took on a peculiar style and content, regardless of the speaker's social status or education. It baffled the logical progression of the learned ministers, but struck the hearts of more open listeners. This was for Friends prophecy, utterances on behalf of the Lord God. Such worship could not be controlled by ordination, licensing, or hierarchy. It was available to all. By now, there were individuals in Dover and neighboring Hampton or across the river in Maine who were meeting in such a manner, but they needed nurture. Annie E. Pinkham's Short History of Dover Friends Meeting explains, under the territorial parish system, the people of the parish were forced by law to attend public worship and were fined for non-attendance. The court records show that in 1663, there was a decided enforcement of penalties here caused by the presence of Quakers. Two of Dover's original settlers, Thomas Roberts and his wife, Rebecca Hilton, were among them. The earliest houses in Dover probably resembled this reconstructed West Country fisherman's family cottage in colonial Pemaquid, Maine. After, not log cabins, by the way, as you'll read in some histories. After serving as head of the independent northern province of New Hampshire until its demise in 1642, Roberts held various minor town offices and, though a regular member of the established church, was inclined to be liberal in his views. So when the Quaker missionaries came to town, he favored giving them a fair hearing and opposed having the women whipped, as they were by order of the court. As one genealogy said, Roberts was not of Puritanic mold. He possessed a liberality of thought which led him to embrace the teachings of the Quaker missionaries who had come here in the early 60s and secured a following from among the Orthodox church people. While he sympathized with the missionaries and was fined by being deprived of his cow for attending their meetings and staying away from public worship, his two sons, John and Thomas, both constables, zealously executed their appointed part of Massachusetts order, expelling the missionaries from his jurisdiction. One of the sons, according to the history, administered to the women 11 stripes for good measure instead of 10. Thomas Roberts is said to have followed the carts, lamenting out loud the wickedness of his sons. Even though Dover was on the frontier of English settlement, the community was not ignored after the departure of the first missionaries in the service of Friends. Waves of new Quakers came calling. Among those visiting Dover was Elizabeth Houghton during her second visit to America between late 1663 and early 1666. She is a vastly underestimated figure in Quaker history, typically described by George Fox as his first convert, though I will argue otherwise. To me, she is the first Quaker, period, and the first mother of the Quaker movement, no slight to Margaret Fell later. Histories of the founding of the Society of Friends typically focus on the religious searching and wanderings by a troubled Fox, who later described how in early 1647 he met with some tender people and a very tender woman whose name was Elizabeth Houghton. And with these I had some meetings and discourses, but my troubles continued, and I was often under great temptations, and I fasted much and walked abroad in solitary places many days, and often took my Bible and went and sat in hollow trees and lonesome places till night came on, and frequently in the night walked mournfully about by myself, for I was a man of sorrows in the times of the first workings of the Lord in me. His journal describes his continuing wanderings, dwelling no more than a month anywhere, and his realization that the learned priest were of little aid to him. The fact that Houghton is named at all is remarkable. She was probably already preaching in public. Her husband, Samuel, had been an elder in the Nonconformist Assembly. More astonishing was a transformation that occurred between Fox's first encountering her and after. He was a changed man. When he met her, she was 47 and a married mother with 6 children. He was 22. She and her husband had settled in Skegby, Nottinghamshire, near Mansfield, where she emerged as a leader among the English dissidents affiliated with the General Baptist. Unlike the Particular Baptist, with their heavily Calvinist leanings, these were deeply influenced by Dutch Mennonites, and many of the English General Baptists would later become Quaker, bringing with them an organization of lay ministers and elders in a pacifist orientation that Fox would reshape into a uniquely Quaker structure. Before his arrival, something had occurred to cause the Skegby Baptist to shatter. In Mennonite practice, before the annual love feast can be celebrated, all members must be in accord, forgiving their differences. If not, the communion must be delayed until resolution can be accomplished. There are suggestions that some of their quarrels in this period may have been over radical social action, such as that proposed by the Levelers and Diggers. Even so, remnants of the Baptist group met for worship at Tootin's home, and soon after Fox had his epiphany, he returned to his circle to voice his experience and gain confirmation. What you're looking at is from one of Hooton's surviving letters to George Fox, 1655, if I'm reading the script right. As you can see, she was illiterate. In 1661, at the age of 60, she made her first trip to New England with her friend Joan Broxop. In those days, ocean crossings were lengthy and arduous. Yet after intense persecution, she returned to England and then shot back to New England within a year, carrying with her a letter from the king, allowing her to buy land and thus escape the vagrancy law. Not that the letter was accepted anywhere in New England. She still underwent harsh persecution, much of it under the Cart and Whip Act. Quite simply, despite her age, she was tough in her body, emotions, and soul, and nothing would deter her or her Quaker colleagues from spreading their message. When her travels this time brought her into New Hampshire, she was jailed in Hampton for testifying against the rapacity of a priest in seizing the goods of a friend, two actually, and not just their goods, but most of their estates, including threats to sell their children into slavery. Next, at Dover and Piscataqua, as she put it, during a very cold winter, she was placed in the stocks and imprisoned for 4 days. But the Lord upheld and preserved my life, where my service to the Lord was profitable for friends and leaving others without an excuse. Hooton endured extreme brutality in her travels back to Boston. I'll spare you the details, but we'll say she miraculously survived. Similar journals by traveling friends provide insightful details of life among Dover friends over the years until the custom declined in the mid-1800s. Some of these weighty Quakes, as we sometimes call them, spent several years apiece in Dover. And as far as we know, George Fox never visited Dover in his trips to America. He spent most of his New England time safely in Rhode Island. Thank you. How's that? As Quaker faith took hold along the Piscataqua, it created a distinctive culture built on extended families. The marriage customs, for example, included a service that's essentially a meeting for worship. This is the certificate for the poet Greenleaf Whittier's parents when they wed in the Dover meeting house. It's one practice that continues. Everyone at a Quaker marriage signs the certificate as witnesses after the couple has risen and exchanged their promises. I could speak for an hour simply discussing this sample and the folks who signed it. Well, actually, I did that a couple of months ago, and it's available to YouTube through the Whittier Birthplace Museum in Haverhill, Massachusetts. As I discovered, the celebrated poet had a lot of connections in Dover. The decades of violence involving the indigenous people and their French allies were especially difficult for Friends and their pacifist discipline. Dover sat on the frontier and suffered repeated attacks, starting with the decimation of Cocheco Village, today's downtown Dover, Oyster River, today's Durham, twice, and South Berwick. Dover men were not exempt from militia service, though some refused to bear arms when they mustered. Much research needs to be done here. The Otis family was especially hard hit in the 1689 Cocheco raid. At Richard Otis's house garrison, the 64-year-old blacksmith, his son Stephen, and daughter Hannah were killed. His third wife, Griselle, 3-month-old daughter Margaret, 3 daughters from his first marriage, Judith, Rose, and Experience, and at least 2 grandchildren were taken captive. One adult son, Richard Jr., escaped. The garrison was burned. The Otis family was Quaker. Early on, Richard, along with his wife and maid, were once fined for missing 13 congregational services when they worshiped instead with friends. Now in the attack, his granddaughter, Mary, and her two brothers were among those taken prisoner. The brothers were carried to Canada and never returned. Mary, however, was rescued at Conway and came back to Dover. About 4 years later, she married Ebenezer Varney, another survivor, and they built a large house on the west side of Garrison Hill. There, they had 13 children. In spite of their experience, or maybe because of it, they always left the door unbolted at night so that natives might enter and warm themselves. As a family history relates, it was no unusual thing for them to find several friendly Indians sleeping before the big fireplace in the morning. What we know as Garrison Hill, by the way, was originally Varney Hill. Besides, there was never a garrison on it. The last fatal attack in Dover was on the Quaker Hanson family on Knox Marsh Road. I'll leave that tragic story for you to read in the book. I do wonder if the Hanson house looked like this at the time of the raid in 1725 or was enlarged later. The image, by the way, is from the library's marvelous historic online gallery. Today, only a bronze monument marker sits by the north side of Knox Marsh Road. Do stop by and read it sometime. Let me return to the book itself. Refusal to participate in war and their marriage customs aren't the only ways friends differed from their neighbors. While Quakers took their Bibles seriously, they diverged from other denominations by reading many of the passages as accounts of human experiences more than law. That made it more personal, reflecting a faith based more on one's relationship with the divine and each other than with any system of rewards and punishments. You know, the thou shalt nots. These became their own stories interwoven into daily perceptions. Alas, over time, friends too would often fall into that legalism trap, but that is one of the hazards of trying to live true to a disciplined ideal. The woman shown is not a Dover friend, but wearing Quaker garb typical of the mid-1800s. She was, by the way, a member of the Coffin family, which had an important branch in early Dover. Among the concepts that shaped their shared faith was the phrase peculiar people, first found in Deuteronomy. There it's combined with the phrase a holy people, which is fine as long as it doesn't lead to holier than thou. At least Quakers were tempered by a strong sense of humility, backed by a backbone of stubbornness. Make of it what you will. The phrase is repeated again in Deuteronomy as well as in Titus and 1 Peter. Combined with the Apostle Paul's counsel about avoiding the pagan ways of the world or worldly people, it was something some friends in our own time are recasting as empire. Early on, they proclaimed their faith to be primitive Christianity revived from before the dark night of apostasy that had set upon the church, reflecting the wonder that filled them in what they called the everlasting gospel. For historical accuracy, let me point out that the golden age they envisioned likely never existed, but the ideal did propel them to pursue a peaceable kingdom here on earth. I sometimes compare this to what happened in the Renaissance when Italians set out to recreate Greek drama with its pitched inflections and wound up with opera instead. From my candid perspective, that's an improvement. Early friends, on the other hand, would have been opposed to both. As for peculiar, it can mean a lot, not just odd or eccentric, but also unusual, exceptional, notable, singular, outstanding, even quaint. That last one hurts when I look ahead at friends. The center of a Quaker community is and was in worshiping together. Sometimes that happens spontaneously when paths crossed or after a meal. For that matter, it still can if folks are paying attention. Not just Quakers either. If you look on this slide, you notice the date is, instead of saying 7th month, July, 31, its 7th month. She died in 3rd month, or March. That was part of the custom, not just months, we also didn't use the names of days of the week, as we commonly do. On Sundays, we named for the sun, Monday, Moon Day, Tuesday, I think it was Twog's Day, Wednesday, Wotan's Day, those were pagan names. So we would do first day, second day, third day. We weren't alone in that. I think the Seventh Day Adventists still do that too. But in some ways, historic Friends resembled today's Amish, but they were far more involved in the wider world and in many ways found themselves on the progressive side of society. As you can imagine, though, the practice could be difficult. Fortunately, we've eased up on much of that discipline while retaining the core values. These are some of what are sometimes called distinctives. That if you wonder ways that Quakers still differ from others, the separation of church and state, that we're not alone in that, of course. No outward ordinances such as water baptism or communion, no liturgy, order of service, dogma, or creed. We worship in waiting silence without a pastor or a priest at the head. But we did often record people with a gift for speaking in service. They were recorded as ministers as well as elders. And we also recorded overseers, people who could take care of the pastoral side of meeting. And actually, when I look at a typical pastor and say, look, wait a minute, you're supposed to do all three of these things? It's I'm kind of impressed. But the testimonies are, it relates to the testimonies. Honesty, we do not swear oaths. It's our yes is yes, no is no, utter honesty. In fact, we think that if you swear an oath in court, that allows you to swear at to lie at other times. I mean, that's an implication, and we don't believe that should always be speaking the truth. Nonviolence, pacifism is one, but even daily speech can be violent, and learning to watch that, anger, and so on. Equality, that of God in all people, men and women, all races, all social classes. Simplicity, originally plainness, including dress, homes, and languages. Direct spiritual experience, and community as mutual discipleship, and often a guarded place of dealing with life. For Quakers, testimony and witness meant consistent actions rather than spoken confession. The peace testimony was one, and in the colonial era, the hat testimony was another. The refusal to remove one's hat in presence of one's so-called social superiors, along with the refusal to take oaths or pay tithes to the official town church. As I mentioned, there was also the testimony of plainness in speech and dress. Here, as a matter of equality, Friends refused to address their so-called social superiors in the plural you, especially when those individuals would turn around and address God in the singular thee. Instead, Friends addressed all individuals as thee and thy, saving thou, you, and your, for the plural, more than one, something many Southerners still observe in their you all expression. In Quaker tradition, a testimony isn't something you say or write, but the reality of how you live. Or as we advise, let your lives speak. Here are some core testimonies that shaped Quaker Friends' culture as it flourished over the decades. Remember, these included everyday action. This undated needlepoint piece, presumably by a Dover friend, quotes a favorite advice from George Fox in 1691. The perspective stands in contrast to the Congregationalist pastors of the time with their elaborately constructed, notated, and sometimes brilliant sermons. Instead, from the silence, Friends ministers burst forth without notes or prior intent as spontaneous oracles of the holy, with a blend of scripture and personal experience, often in sing-song chant. Christ was expected to be present in Quaker worship, and these individuals were to give voice to that spirit. For those not Quaker, the result could be confusing, even incomprehensible, an outburst. But for friends, these messages were a refreshing wellspring. Many of their early writings in that vein strike me as being more similar to contemporary poetry than prose. So I said, other friends having abilities for caring for the membership itself might be designated as overseers. In addition, the clerks for the men's and women's business sessions had to be sensitive to crafting decisions and a unique process of coming to unity on an agenda item without ever taking a vote, and then minuting the consensus in the record book. The emphasis, again, was on a priesthood of all believers with rules arrayed among differing talents. These days, I'll argue that should include an appreciation for the treasurer. And we should also note that when it came to doing business in the early days, the meeting house was arranged so one side were the men, and the other side was the women. And we look at it and wonder about. It was one time you were free from your husband, for one thing. But also, and the preaching could be from either side. When it came time to do business, either shutters would come down, or in our house, I've got them in the wall, they would come down. And it was the one place in the English-speaking world where women could select their own officers, could do their own business, and they had parts of the business that they took care of, especially like taking care of the schools, people in need, widows, orphans, especially. If a husband if there was trouble in a marriage, the husband had to report to the women's side of the meeting. Presumably not the whole meeting, I assume a couple of elders, but it was a different structure. Okay, the women could make a decision to spend money, and then they send two girls over to the men's side and say, you pay for it. I argue that that arrangement, not that I'm advocating we return to it, but I think it cut the length of the business meeting in half. Okay, we already took a look at the headstone and the days of the month. One of the things that noted, for instance, if you think of the current way of doing months, October. October is 8, right? Well, it's 10th month. Okay. I should also note that engraved headstones weren't permitted until the early 1850s. It was considered too much vanity. And even then, they were limited in their height and decor. The one I showed you was from the Quaker corner of Pine Hill Cemetery. In the face of these restrictions, what kept friends coming back? Not all of them did, of course, and their reasons for leaving the faith are many. But a core remained and found deep meaning and nurture as Quakers. A number also relocated, not just up the Cocheco as far as Sandwich or northwest of Vermont, but also prominently to Philadelphia, Providence, Iowa, and Minnesota well before the Civil War, and even the far west, where they helped establish 2 Quaker colleges and the first Friends meeting in California. We can suppose that they weren't the only Dover folks who were restless in the 1800s and played important roles across the country. I'll leave that to another historian who might have fun assembling all the details. Another big surprise, which I share in my book, is the way Dover was a center on both sides of the Piscataqua. Dover Quaker Meeting even had meeting houses in Berwick and Eliot, somewhat the way Roman Catholic parishes are being reshaped today. And we also rotated the business. We do business every month as a community, and we would rotate it around the other meeting houses. So in some ways, I argue that Dover was the first Quaker meeting in Maine, rather than the one in Portland. Among the Dover Friends relocating into Maine by 1800, more than 80 individuals and families received membership transfers to Falmouth, today's Portland, and another 20 or so to Vassalboro, near Augusta. Let me remind you, 100 members from a typical congregation is a sizable loss. Should you be interested, the Pembroke Historical Society will be Zooming my presentation about the Maine side of my book at 6:30 p.m. April 18th, and like that, it's a free event. But just came across so much in this. You know, Pembroke, Maine. Yeah. Watch that you don't get the Pembroke, Massachusetts Historical Society. You know, New England, most of the towns are repeated at least 5 times. And I might as well throw in this aside. You know that Dover was not named for the town with the white cliffs. We were named for Robert Dover, an anti-Puritan attorney and wit, named by the name was imported by the second town minister, George Burdett, who was not a Puritan. Tried to, well, Burdett's a whole real interesting story on his own part, scandals and all. And I should say, now that I've relocated to the other end of Maine, these are all common. These names occur quite widely. Actually had a thing doing a presentation at the Senior Citizen Center in Eastport, and I had the name of one of the first people on the Maine side who, not Quaker, but very influential, and trying to read it the way it's spelled, Treworthy. And I got to kind of look, and I finally took Treworthy. So if I have any of the names wrong, let me know. But even after leaving the faith, lines of these families seem to have been positive members of the expanding community, hopefully continuing some of those Quaker values we looked at earlier. As we move ahead, I'm convinced the earlier conflicts made Dover a more tolerant and progressive community. For instance, when the Irish mill girls needed a place to worship, their first Roman Catholic chapel was built, as this plaque proclaims, on the site of St. Mary, with support from the Protestants of this city. Unlike Boston, where at the time no Irish were welcome. And for the record, Dover's mill complex does predate those of Lowell, Lawrence, and Manchester on the Merrimack. I'll leave that history to others, especially Kathy. I still hope she writes the book. Now that we've touched on a few of the highlights from my book, let me add that Dover Friends Meeting is very much alive and would love to have you join us in open worship on Sunday morning. You're seeing us at Apple Harvest Day a few years ago. We are a very serious bunch. Now, who has the first question or comment?
If a person thought that he or she might be descended from one of those names that you had listed on a previous slide, how would one go about researching that? Are there any of those original documents available to look at?
They are, if you want to go to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Our records, which start in about 1701, 1703, which are earlier than First Parish surviving records, but they're now preserved at the University of Massachusetts, has a special Quaker collection. And we have a whole shelf of minutes. That's somebody's PhD dissertation if they want to work on it. I worked from abstracts on it. But to save you the time of doing that, online you can find the abstracts of our Quaker minutes. There's one of marriage certificates, so you can trace through from the marriages, and also family records that were kept. And some of the family records actually predate the 1701. Sitting down to put it together, and I think, oh yeah, my grandfather was so-and-so. So that can go back. In doing my research, I found online genealogists, and don't trust them because, but they can be helpful still. Fortunately, I had a lot of experience doing my own genealogy before that, so you know what you can trust in ink and what you should be putting in pencil. And but I found enough that from the early convictions of people for being Quaker, not missing public worship, and the 1639, 1640 Dover combination, which was signed by 40 of the towns, of the men of the community. 40 out of 60 gives you a pretty good number to work from. Following those names to the beginning of the Quaker records, could piece the dots together pretty well through some of the genealogies I found online. So I'm confident with that. But for doing the research, try online for those two sites. The library also has in its collection some fat books called the New Hampshire Genealogical Record or something like that from 1900 to 1910. The records were serialized. And before internet, I actually photocopied all of those. And it's much easier to chase stuff on a digital file and have to go through all of those pages. But again, those are wonderful records to deal with. The other thing, if you're doing genealogy, to think about is if they weren't complete, if the marriage wasn't like to another Quaker, or if they weren't following the procedures, like running away to a justice of the peace, rather than waiting 2.5 months for the committees to make sure they're clear of other entanglements, they might be read out. Yeah, they could still come to meeting, some like in my family for 3 generations before they rejoined. Still go to Quaker schools. It was, all the world considered them Quaker, except they didn't have to be on a committee. Right.
So how do you track burial areas and how are their graves marked?
They might put just little unmarked stones or just initials. The Meter family up in Meterboro in Rochester, they're historic. They actually have done a wonderful job of preserving the family burial ground there. And it's maybe one of the best examples of a Quaker. You would know that way that you're not planting somebody on top of somebody else's bones. Although Exeter meeting in Pennsylvania ran out of room in their burial ground. So they brought a bunch of dirt in, filled up higher, so it goes like this. In Boston, if you look at some of those old burial grounds, they've got all those old stones on them. They don't know who's really buried under them. It's just someplace down here. So, one of the things that drove Silas Weeks nuts when he was tracing all these old Quaker meeting houses and Quaker burial grounds was trying to figure out where Dover's was. Well, the best I can give you is, it was pretty much the Pinkham Cemetery if you're driving down. Our first meeting house was just north of there. Behind the Pinkham site, back in that Brambley part, you'll find some unmarked stones. You'll find some that actually have the plain dating on them and so on. But Friends still apparently used family burial grounds. In Pine Hill Cemetery, there's one area when you go right up the hill in the entry and on the right where there are Quaker families. And I call that Quaker Corner. But again, the giveaway is if they're using this funny dating system, or some tend to be more discreet and just put years. So they have to do the funny mark, funny months. But yeah. Oh yeah.
You might not have the answer to this. By coincidence, I happened to be reading John Greenleaf Whittier's poetry, and I came across a poem that titled "How the Women Went from Dover, 1662," and it shows a picture of women being led away. Were they Quakers or what were they accused of?
No, they were definitely Quakers. They came to town and spent 3 months here, actually, before they were put on trial. And for being Quakers, they were also coming in. They were from England, and the idea of women teaching, preaching, upset a lot of people. John Rayner's. Well, yeah, but I'm not going to get into a theological argument here. But Quakers had a whole, Paul especially, you can find the other way too. how much is cultural and all that. But at any rate, it was also the thing that they weren't licensed. Ann Hutchinson got in the same problem in Boston. But no, that actually there's a wonderful novel that Olga Merrill did called Vagabond Quakers. And she took that incident and fleshed it out into a whole novel. And the only problem with doing fiction is that when you run into parts that you can't quite put together, you have to come up with something. So she's got one section, it's a marvelous thing on Richard Waldron's first wife. Only Waldron's family says they don't know her name. She got this whole, no, she found somebody who would kind of fit it and put him, yeah.
As the poem goes on, it's a little lengthy, does a terrific job on it. It seems like we're knocking down the Salisbury, and then the Salisbury constable let him go.
Yep.
We're not gonna win.
Right, and released him, and then he came back to town. Okay, there was another question back here. Comment? Oh, sure.
The current Quaker
Oh, yeah.
cemetery in Dover.
Oh, yeah. The our current Quaker cemetery is up behind the Walgreens, across from the Hannaford and Shaw's. It was the T. Worcester Brown family cemetery, and Thomas Worcester Brown was, in fact, his when I showed you the wedding certificate, his father and sister signed it, but he went to his grandfather, I think. He and his brother went to Philadelphia in the early 1800s from Dover, and he became a very successful dry goods merchant, and was a founder of Providence Bank. Served many terms on the Haverford College Board, endowed 3 chairs, gave the bulk of his library to the founding of the college library. And he's a remarkable story in his own right. I include some of that in here. But that's now under the care of Dover Friends, and we're hoping to fill it with good people, not all Quakers. It's one place, if you're looking at a green burial, for instance, without having embalming and all that sort of thing, it's an alternative that we do offer. So anything else I needed to pitch on that?
In the Quaker, yeah.
Okay,
Quaker would be in there
for now, yeah. But we're,
Did the Quakers come across the ocean from England because they were persecuted there, or they just came over here because they saw the opportunity?
they came over to, because they were spreading this revolutionary experience of Christ, they would put it. And one of the fascinating things to be looking at is maybe the reason they got into it so heavily with the Puritans was because they didn't think the Puritans went far enough, that they were more like a family kind of feud, that you're not going, you need to do more, you're falling short. And while the Puritans in this period can come across as villains, compared to what's happening in Virginia, they were pretty lenient. Virginia, you could be executed for missing public service 3 times. We're not sure that actually happened, or we're just not sure if it did, it wasn't recorded. But we do know of at least one Quaker who died of being really beaten to death and thrown into a damp cellar, and others who really fled in terror. So, yeah. Yeah, or Eppin, as old timers will correct you. Yeah, I mentioned Hampton being a very active meeting. Dover, for the first, New Hampshire for the first century had 4 towns: Hampton, Strawberry Bank, Portsmouth, and Exeter. 2 of them had a lot of Quaker activity. So you had some coming up the Merrimack that way. And I think theirs came out of that meeting, the same way that we had meetings in other. But there was also a strong presence coming up from Salem, Massachusetts, which was the other Quaker meeting north of Boston. But we were in motion together. You know, you might marry somebody in another meeting back and forth, but no, Eppin was not under Dover's care. It's a lovely meeting house, by the way, if you go down.
Is it possible to gain entrance and perhaps be shown around in this meeting house other than on Sunday?
Jenny?
Sure. We could arrange a time.
Bill?
I'm a convert to Quakerism. I was a congregational there for 23 years, and in 1994, when I was 50, I wandered into that building, which I encourage you all to do. And what struck me about it, one thing was that women spoke as much as men. Like it was a free place. Children could speak too. And it gradually, as I read it in the library, I realized the important thing is that you feel spoken to by God, and you've held it back 7 times, and then you deliver what you think is something that's a spiritual message. So once I delivered a message about depleted uranium in Iraq, and Americans, and spoiling, deforming Iraqi children. And the result of that was that I was elderly. That means I was taken aside by the elders and said that was not really spiritual, that was political. But somewhere in there, Quakers can be quite strongly political when they refuse to serve in the military and go to prison, which they did. For example, during World War II, that was the so-called good war. Quakers would rather go to civil service or to jail than to fight.
But some did.
Or another thing will happen, you might get up and speak on something that esoteric, and somebody else will have, okay, this is what you can do about it, or something. I remember down in Cambridge, somebody up in the gallery speaking of really discovering the gospel by singing in Bach's St. John Passion, which is not performed very often. And there was some technical part, and somebody else had, no, that was one of his rare descending minor key alleluias, which is why it was so stirring. The stuff that you run into, I argued that sometimes we're like 3 degrees separation from, you know, if you're trying to connect. I remember one time somebody was trying to get a hold of Sister Jean Prigine, the woman of Dead Man Walking, the one who was really the expert on as a prison chaplain, and she really needed to get a hold of her, and because she was, this was somebody not in our meeting, but away, she was prison chaplain to somebody who was going to be executed in 3 days, and it just so happened that I knew where she was. She was staying with Carol Van Einingham. So, oh yeah, I got her phone number. That kind of connection just happens a lot. It's a wonderful world to be in.
Your book and another lecture you gave, I heard, focused on the Quaking River.
Right.
Where the settlements were and why they were there, because they were all accessible by water.
Yep.
You don't have a slide of that, do you?
Not handy. I've got it set up for the other one. You know, that thing is, somebody's starting to run through all of these to find everything, and it takes 5 minutes to maybe get close, or 5 minutes to find out you don't have it. But
So it started at Hilton Head, right?
yeah, and that was really the center of development for both New Hampshire and Maine.
But it's now a park.
Yeah, living where I do on the Atlantic, up on the other end of Maine, really aware of how much living around water is a whole different way of looking at community placement. You know, like we think of Elliott being 13 miles or 18 miles by road from Dover around. But if you go down to Hilton Point and you look across, the water there, that's where Kittery House was built. That was the heart of Kittery. Kittery wasn't down there, it was up here. And just up a little bit more by that, across from St. Thomas Aquinas School, if you look out when the trees are, you see this, look at high tide, and there's a big stream that goes up, Sturgeon Creek. Well, our first meeting house was near, just south of St. Thomas Aquinas High School. When we built a new one, and we could combine the two little meeting houses that we had, they took that one, took it down the hill, put it on a barge or a gondola, took it across the river, up the Sturgeon Creek, took it off, and that's where the meeting house was. So, you know, it looks like such a long distance. You look at it there, and it's a piece of cake. You know, okay, story. This idea of, you know, you're all fishermen. You know, you hear the stories, like somebody out on the Isles of Shoals would decide he wanted to go into Portsmouth for a drink, maybe a little dancing. So get on a boat, row in from the Isles of Shoals, you know how far it looks out there, all the way into Portsmouth, and then maybe half crocked, rows all the way back, maybe by moonlight. What happens if you miss the island? But they consider this commonplace. So I'm standing down on the breakwater with one of the guys in town, somebody who grew up there. He said, yeah, I used to date a girl out there, this Canadian side, way out, you know, you can barely see the, yeah, I'd borrow a boat. So did you ask permission? I always return it in good shape. Okay, you could go out there and you know, visit. How long did it take you to get there? 40 minutes. It would take you in Campobello Island, an hour and a half at least to go all the way around. But he'd go out, he'd find the current. It's always going in two directions in the water there. Ride the current out, and then coming back, he'd ride it back. So I asked one of our neighbors who had been a commercial fisherman, and she said, yeah, I bet it took him longer to get home too. But that kind of awareness, you know, the boat's there, you row across the river, use the tides. That's just a whole different way of looking at the settlement. Some of the early Quaker families, the Jenkins family, relocated from Eliot to Durham. You look on the map, that's a long, you know, why'd you do that? You look by the water, it's a straight shot. So, you know, these surprises you find just looking at it from a whole different point of view. Dover's a remarkable place. The kind of, you know, we think of it as being as kind of a sleepy place, but in the 1600s, the kind of people, one of the governors, the agents for the, I'm not even sure quite how to call them. They're often called proprietors, but Kathy Fink at the, or Kathy, Diane Fisk at First Parish says, no, they didn't own the land. Yeah, they didn't, you know, what did they own? They owned, I guess, kind of like a lease to do business here. I mean, how all these arrangements worked is utterly baffling to me. You didn't own the land on your property. In fact, you know, on Hampton Beach, a lot of those places, they had 99-year leases, and in the past couple of years, they've lost the leases. Okay, you own the house, what do you do with it? Kind of thing. But somehow we came together and became a much more tolerant community, I think, than many that you would find to the south. And the ways we evolved once the mills came, you know, it became a whole different place too. So, yes.
So, if Quakers was mercenary of the Quakers, now it's this century, so should they fall in love, or if they fall in love with someone that's not a Quaker, what happens?
A lot of that discipline has changed. Yeah. Yeah. No. It's.
One of the spouses can still attend.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, going into that kind of thing. You know, I'm not dressed in plain coat either. You know, in gray and not wearing a broad brim hat. I write fiction, that would have been a no-no. But one of the things that I really find fascinating, would love to see develop more, is what happened in the Congregational church. Oh, by the way, the Puritans never called themselves Puritans. That was one label that was applied by others. Everybody knew who they were. But how they went from this very fundamentalist, idealistic, and often ways progressive mindset that they had. They came over to establish a utopia. And they saw this way that life could be. It wasn't under the English social structure. This was more economically egalitarian, more opportunity for all. But how they went from that to, in a century and a half, having a Unitarian side, and really moderating, becoming much more open, in some ways taking Quaker stances. Some of the, Jeremy Belknap, when he was minister here, argued that they should not be supported by tax money, but should be the members should be paying their own offerings to the church to support it. And that was put up to vote in town, and he was voted down. I guess the other members of the church decided they didn't want to, they'd rather have tax money. I don't know, but it's those sorts of things. But, the kind of change that happened internally too. Yeah, in fact, thinking of changes, the Puritans early on, the music in theirs was this dirge of sung psalms. And then eventually they decided to have musical accompaniment, maybe to liven things up. They allowed a bass viol, and I think that was in 1720. But I can't imagine trying to sing to a bass viol. Yes?
General question between the Quakers and the Shakers, did they kind of evolve on the same time frame, or one before the other?
Yeah, the Shakers started in northern England in the late 1700s, so we're over 100 years later, around Mother Ann Lee. And she developed a following. They had music, they had dancing, which we didn't. It was religious dancing, kind of jerky stuff from what I've heard. And the celibacy was big, in contrast to Quakers who had large families. And somehow a much healthier mortality rate than the general populace, and usually married at older age than the general populace. Women were often in their early 20s rather than 13 or 14 or 16 or whatever they often were. But this kind of difference. But the Shakers developed this communal, and I don't know how much they carried with them. They were sometimes called the Shaking Quakers, but wonderful legacy, but also a lot of really quirky things, like you could only sleep on one side, and things like this, that we conveniently overlook. But really, that's a whole fascinating story that follow it. And speaking of the Maine connection, Alfred, Maine, up the road, was one of their two centers in Maine. And that's where the hymn Simple Gifts was written by Joseph Brackett. And then up above that, just south of Lewiston, Auburn, was Sabbath Day Lake, and there's still some Shakers there. So well worth checking out. Alfred, by the way, has been preserved by Roman Catholic monastics. So in a way, the tradition continues. Bill?
Another thing I like about the Quakers, aside from the fact that they come from all religious, people now in that building come from all religious traditions.
Yep.
They've got hired sermons, they've got hired liturgies, even tired of jumping up and down singing. They want to come and doze off or listen to the most fervent thoughts of their neighbors. It's never the same because it's people speaking from the heart. And you only get maybe 2 or 3 or 5 messages Time.
Sometimes none.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and we're comfortable with that.
And there are those who doze off. It's, anything goes, and then what I like best is the refreshments afterwards. Again, it's whatever someone is moved to bring, and there's soup, there's homemade bread. It's a congregation, it's always sweets. And, you know, it's only telling sweets, but, so that makes for better conversation, and after over time, you begin to know people, just because of the reception time afterwards.
Yeah, but we're not alone in that way. I can think of some others who put out really wonderful spreads. And I remember one of the rabbis in town saying, you know, I mentioned, you know, in the New Testament, all of these big things happen around meals, around food. It's been said that you can't read the New Testament without getting hungry. He said, yeah, that's because Jesus was a Jew. You're always eating in national, you know, conversation. So yeah, we need the broad vision here. So, any more? Well, I'll thank you all for coming out then. There are copies of the